Thank you, Babasan. Also, thank you for the candor. We don't always hear from executives in large corporations the degree of global warming that the company is causing, and the acknowledgement that it is causing it, and the commitment to fix it. So thank you for that. I'm sure that's appreciated by our next speaker, who is Patricia Purcell. Patricia's a senior advisor at the United Nations Development Program, and she's responsible for nature, energy, and climate. So, Tricia, just give us your perspective on where we are and why you think the private sector are so important as we go forward.
Great, thanks so much, Charles, and thanks to Peace One Day and to my fellow panelists for being here and having this opportunity. I mean, look, this comes at a really urgent time. I think I've listened to some of the speakers, today, and even the last one right before our panel. And it's great to hear from youth, and it's great to hear, from inspiring messages, and, get out there and, own this and do what you can. And for sure, I mean, we need that. It has to be all hands on deck. That means individuals of every demographic. It means companies. It means, it means the UN, of course. It means governments. But I do really appreciate the direction that my fellow panelists are pointing to, because ultimately, we are on a pathway that is quite catastrophic, right? We've heard from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN Secretary General that we have reached a code red for humanity, as they call it. A 1.5 degrees sort of threshold in warming is what we were looking at a few years ago in Paris. And now, just 7 years later, we're looking at more than that, 2.5, 2.7 degrees trajectory. To put that into perspective and what that means, because it doesn't sound like a lot, right? I mean, most people are like, so what, 2 degrees, 1.5, what's the big difference? The difference is, as you started out the panel discussion, Charles, recognizing the collapse of some of the key ecosystems, right? That will result in extreme warming. But just to give you a sense of, sort of the difference why 1 degree or, a half a degree matters. If we tip over 1.5 degrees, 70% of the coral reefs that we have now will die. At over 2%, all will be lost. And this isn't just like pretty because people like to scuba dive and, snorkel and look at the reefs. They are essential for maintaining global fish stocks, which relate to food security, which relate to livelihoods. They're also significantly important for health, as they're used, medicines derived from coral reefs. I mean, likewise, we're on track to lose about a billion species, by mid-century, toward the end of this century, and insects, which are vital for pollination of crops and plants. Again, we're looking at issues of food security, of habitable land where people can actually live. We've seen heat waves. I mean, we're seeing the highest temperature we've seen on record, right? So all of this matters. The sea level rise 10 centimeters higher means most cities, where most of the population growth that is approaching nearly 10 billion people by mid-century, they won't be inhabitable. Many cities can't afford to put up seawalls and really put the investment in that they will be necessary to adapt. So we are at a very critical time, and it is super important that companies, like my fellow panelists, are really looking at these next generation, services, products that not only will reach and influence the demand and behavior of consumers, but also, as Babasan was saying, of businesses themselves. I think fortune will favor those who see the writing on the wall for the opportunity this is, right? And that's an important message, because it's not all doom and gloom. We are actually, in the midst of a tremendous historical opportunity and a paradigm shift. I read something interesting just to close on this point the other day, that half of all business revenues will come from products and services that haven't even been created yet, just in the next few years, before even 2025, before 2030, right? Likewise, we're looking at energy scenarios for the global energy sector, which is critical to decarbonize the global energy sector to transition to more renewable energy mix. Half of the emissions reductions that we'll need from the technologies there that will enable this transition are currently in demonstration or prototype phase. So we need to significantly accelerate in the investment and the deployment of these new technologies and these new products and services. And so that pace and that scale is very important, and it's great to hear that is the direction that many of these companies are going in. Thanks. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. Let's think about this this issue of confusion, because if we look at climate change as a brand or a narrative, just for a moment, and that's partly why we're here on this panel. If we just think of it like that, we know a little bit about building brands. We know there needs to be a consistent narrative that consumers and citizens and people want confidence in the everyday choices that they're making. But I might go to Serge. Serge, why do you think the confusion exists today? And you've joined this climate coalition with us to try and fix this. How do you think we can begin to go about solving this issue of confusion?
Yeah, great question. And I think with our initiative, we'll try to find the answer. It really starts with, I think, everyone, and especially everyone who is watching today, wants to, have an impact on the climate in a positive way. But everyone is wondering, how can I have the maximum impact? And there are, many people, many corporations being involved one way or the other. But in most of the time, because of probably lack of transparency, and thanks Baba-san for indeed being transparent, lack of trust, because with transparency comes trust. With transparency, yes, comes trust. And then because of sometimes poor communication or corporate communication, which are a bit jargon, the consumer is really, or the people really don't know, who to associate themselves with. And that's what we need to change. And so I think we have to indeed find a way to brand climate. That maybe, a fast forward to a conclusion here, which we have not come up with yet. But, there was obviously the whole biofood initiative that was a bit lingering for so long. And I think it's only when there was indeed a clear branding around bioproducts and then good back to transparency and trust, that there was a whole system around it that you could trust what you would buy and that is labeled bio. And then that you had indeed supplier, wholesale, distribution that was really going in that direction to bring this to the consumer in an easy to consume way. That's really the whole bio industry took off. So I think we have to indeed, the buy green or reuse green, because as we know, part of, climate protection is probably to buy less, consume less, and reuse more. So it's not about just buying green, but it's also about, so that's why it cannot be just the answer, but we need to also reuse more and communicate better.
Baba-san, you were in a session with us last week in New York, where we had about 50 consumers there, and we had some experts, and you and Tricia were there. We asked the question to all 50 people in the room, how many of you are clear about what companies are saying? Or do you trust companies on this issue of climate and sustainability? You saw the show of hands. Only about 2 people were clear about what companies are really saying. How do we get through this? How do we, you've started this by being quite candid about where Panasonic is today. How do we get companies to be more honest and more clear about their communications? I don't know if you have a view on that.
Well, yeah, I think the discussion around the climate change is still surprise side, as you, Charles, mentioned. So we need an entire community, all people on the planet has to be demand side conversation, because demand side is our life. It's not others. So I had the chance to chat with my younger daughter yesterday. She is in middle school. She said, look, I did homework about climate change. What is climate change? What is the reason? What is the problem? What is the solution? Oh, sounds amazing. Tell me about the reason part. The reason is CO2. Okay. What is the reason for the CO2? She said, human activities. Okay. Oh, beyond my expectation. What kind of human activities? I asked. So extract and burn fossil fuel, she answered. Oh, have you ever burned fossil fuel or extracted? It sounds to me like others' human activities, not our human activities. So use human language. So science, so she said the science is the human language, but so yes, but if you translate it your daily language, your homework will be far better. I'm not good dad to interrupt my exciting daughter, but this is happening all the time in my job. So Panasonic has a great consumer DNA, even after transforming into a balanced B2B brand and business portfolio. But this is something we need, that putting the people's life at the center of everything we do for any conversation, any climate conversation, especially.
Great, thank you, Baba. Tricia, I know the United Nations is getting quite concerned about greenwashing. Last year the COP was very much about pledges. The subject of ESG is in, every corporate report, and there's beginning to be some concerns about some of the measurement aspects around climate. How do we find our way through this? How do we rise above the debates about, stakeholder capitalism and what now people are starting to call woke capitalism? I mean, already you can feel the dividing lines around all of these subjects. How do we keep people clear about the decisions they should be making when buying products and services from companies and making decisions in their daily lives?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I mean, it's such an excellent question, because you're right. I mean, there's a huge unintended consequence of actually what started as with best intentions, right? So environmental social governance, ultimately, sort of doing no harm. That's the backbone principle behind ESG. But there's so many frameworks out there. There's so many interpretations out there. And then, fast forward to, just in recent years, net zero, and what does that actually mean? And there was a lot of excitement at the last UN climate conference in Glasgow about net zero. And as you say, a lot of, great pledges, and pledges are good. Commitments are important. But now there is a big question, given the urgency we were just discussing a few moments ago, about how that translates into action, right? So, I mean, as colleagues on the panel know, and are some of the leaders actually in these commitments and driving ambition among their peers and wider, corporate and investor community. There needs to be sort of a pipeline for these actual commitments to land. So if we're saying we're aligning, half of all of assets, investor assets with 1.5 degrees and net zero, well, that's great, but explain where that's going, and I think as Baba-san's daughter is learning at school, it really has to be about that, first and foremost is that energy transition. I mean, this is where the vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions, come from. But we have to put in place the infrastructure, the architecture, the policies, but also the business opportunities for that transition, right? And those opportunities also include jobs. I mean, if you hear there are 8 billion, 13 million jobs to be created, just in the next few decades. So and that will replace jobs that are lost. So there are opportunities, but it's going to require a concerted investment, not only financial investment, but a concerted sort of investment in people, right? And so I think some of the fundamentals of of the ESG sort of framework, around the social is still valid, but I think the conversation needs to move on. And the other sort of differentiation there is that a lot of ESG is really just being about disclosure, right? Reporting, disclosure, compliance. We are seeing more scrutiny. There are more regulations coming down the pike, and they will impact on companies' business decisions and how they are compliant. But I think companies want to and are going beyond that. I mean, we have something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which I don't know, Charles, as a branding expert, might say has been pretty successful. As far as an intergovernmental brand that we came up with, and we companies and and the public as well, but mainly companies, as we're talking about ESG, have to decide how are we going to use the framework that we do have as a lever for future sustainable growth while doing so profitably. And I think that's the kind of the evolution of the paradigm shift that we're seeing on the horizon now. And companies can't wait. They can't wait for the regulation. They can't wait to be called out, for greenwashing, because of course, not only for reputational risk, but also the younger people who want to work for, when Babasan's daughter graduates, where is she going to want to go work, right? I mean, where are the young people today, going to put their own investments? So it does matter, for a future, not just profitability bottom line, but also for how a company is positioned in terms of its employees, in terms of its staff, well beyond just, sort of risk, reputational risk today, but tomorrow and over the mid and longer term.